I remember it was like late 2015, and I was sort of a sad, lonely teenager. Um, my social life at the time was basically non-existent, and what social life there was existed almost entirely online. I'd play a lot of FIFA, GTA Online, that sort of thing, and I had friends online, but in real life, I was never really hanging out with people. And I had, I think I was going through a period of quite low self-worth. Um, I struggled to sort of put myself out there and make friends, and I think I wanted somewhere to redirect my energy to sort of exist in a different world from the one that I was in, and experience a good story. And I have this really distinctive memory of, I was watching this, I think it was a Watch Mojo video, and it had Geralt and Triss were in it, and it was discussing The Witcher 3, and they're in this lighthouse and they're like making out, and then it's kind of implied that maybe something else happens. And I just remember thinking, like, as many hormonal teenagers would have done in that moment, like, oh, great, like, you can get laid in this game? Like, I want to play this, which is actually really embarrassing. So anyway, off I went with some gaming friends to, my closest CEX, which was like a 2-hour bus journey away from my hometown. And we get there, and obviously I don't really have a lot of facial hair right now, but at the time I had even less. So I went in and I tried to buy a copy of it, and obviously they said no. So I didn't get a copy, and then I went outside and I said to a friend of mine who was like maybe 6'1", and he had a little bit of facial hair. His name's Lawrence. If you're watching this, mate, I hope you're doing good. And I asked him if he'd go in and buy it for me, and he did. He went in, and obviously he looked plausibly 18, so he managed to buy a copy. And I suppose that's the end of the story, really, in terms of we managed to get it. I took it home, and then it was, I would say, one of the most significant entertainment products, or the most significant entertainment products I've ever played. And then throughout 2016, I think I played the game through 6, maybe 7 times. And anyway, 6, 7. So then I fell in love with it. The characters were great. You got characters like Geralt, and he's a monster slaying badass, and he's so self-assured and just brilliant, really. And Yennefer, who's a sassy bastard, and Ciri's out there on this hero's journey, and her story is so interesting to follow. And then you've got an excellent cast of supporting characters, the likes of Lambert, what a prick, and Uncle Vesemir. All of these fantastic side characters. There's so many more that I could name, but I won't bother. Who made the story much more, enriching and interesting. And I really, really enjoyed playing it. And I think, as I say, at that time, it felt easier to exist in the world of The Witcher than in the real world in many ways, because it was this escapism thing for me. I am at a bus stop. I remember in my first playthrough of the game, I tried to romance both Yennefer and Triss, and for those of you who've played the game, that doesn't go particularly well. Ciri became a Witcher, Uncle Vesemir obviously died, the Wild Hunt were defeated, Lambert survived in my playthrough, but I think it was a tough pill for me to swallow, because as well as my own love life being a bit of a tragic story, Geralt's was too, and I just wasn't really satisfied with how I'd ended the game. And I remember quite distinctively that when I finished the game, you have your roll credits, and then you get plonked in Kaer Morhen, and this box of text just comes across the screen, and it says something like, "The story of Geralt of Rivia has come to a close." And I just felt this real emptiness, that the game was finished. I'd already been round Skellige and done every single pointless little point of interest in the sea, picked up all those little loot caches everywhere. There wasn't really anything else for me to do in the game beyond that, so I felt like the only thing I could do was restart the story and try and do the romance options a bit better, and maybe pay a bit more attention to the story and do things in a better way. Anyway, so I started a new playthrough. I reloaded my save from Novigrad. I remember the save file was called Broken Flowers, so that must have been the name of the quest, of where I was. And it's just before you meet Triss in the game, and I decided that, okay, I'm going to redo this and just basically cock block myself as hard as humanly possible and make sure that Geralt and Triss don't end up together. And I succeeded in that. I paid a lot more attention to the subplot with Radovid and made sure he was assassinated. And by the time my second roll credits had come around, I was a lot more satisfied with how I'd ended the game. It was a way better ending. It still had that emptiness of, you know, finishing the game and not having anyone else to see, but I could always just replay the game over and over and over again, which was, I guess, what I would go on to do. I think what I'd realised in those various playthroughs of the game was that I just really enjoyed role-playing as Geralt. I think for me at the time it was a great way to escape into a different universe and to escape the emotional turmoil, really, of being a teenager. I think you can view escapism in a number of different ways. You can view it as a form of self-actualization or self-expression, as a way to find meaning in a difficult world, you know, and freedom. And I think you can also view it as a defense mechanism, really. And I think for me at the time, it was probably all three, really. I was struggling with issues of social anxiety at school. You know, I would sit in form or in lessons with people who I'd at one point in time considered friends, and I'd really struggle to just sit and have a conversation with them. But within the world of The Witcher, I was Geralt, you know, a monster-slaying legend, basically, who, you know, was quite self-assured and quite confident, and in spite of the fact that he was a mutant, you know, rejected by society, living on the edge of society, you know, he was very self-assured and very self-confident. And I think, you know, in many ways, Geralt's a really great role model for a teenager. He's, you know, there's lots and lots of reasons that he has to not accept himself, but he still chooses to accept himself. You know, he accepts others as well when they've done wrong. You know, you look at the story of the Bloody Baron. You know, it's a depressive, abusive, alcoholic maniac, really, in many ways. But he encourages him to find the path to getting back in touch with his family, or at least he helps him get back in touch with his family, and, you know, try and make right of a bad situation. He speaks with Sienna at the end of Blood and Wine, and, you know, she's tyrannical and abusive towards her sister in many ways, really not a very nice person. And he manages to help them reconnect. You know, for a teenager who felt a bit rudderless and didn't really know, you know, who he wanted to be, and when he would, you know, be with other people, he'd sort of almost, meaning me, I would almost try and squash my own personality to help myself fit in with others. Geralt was a really good role model for encouraging me to, even if I didn't realise it, just be myself, and just accept myself for who I am. So, you know, cheers to Geralt for that. So sometime after my various playthroughs in late 2015, early 2016, I plucked up the courage and the finances to buy the DLC pass. And I played through Hearts of Stone initially first. It was probably maybe March, April 2016, so just before just before Blood and Wine had come out. Played through Hearts of Stone, and it was just such a fantastic DLC. You know, Gauntro Dim, or God, but really the devil, is probably one of the best bad guys I've ever come across in any video game. He was awesome, you know, and all geared with this contract that they have adds a moral greyness to the story about how bad of a bad guy is he really. He's very much the sort of lawful evil type character rather than the chaotic evil type character. You know, Olgierd signed the contract that led to his Heart of Stone, and Gaunter uses that against him throughout the plot, which is just a really engaging conflict in a way that I would say that the Wild Hunt wasn't. Now, the Wild Hunt was a good plot, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't as good as Gauntro Dim. Anyway, after I'd finished playing Hearts of Stone, I then moved on to Blood and Wine, which is probably one of the most expansive DLCs I've ever played. It was essentially a whole new game, which is obviously a thing that a lot of people have said. And then I remember the Witcher card game came out, Gwent the Witcher card game came out, and I got really into that, and I think that was me maybe trying to dip my toe into trying to be a bit more social, because I got quite involved in the online community around that. And a bit of a humble brag, but I made it to 23rd in the world in the open beta rankings, or open beta, I don't know, who cares. Anyway, and then I think really I just wanted to enjoy playing The Witcher and experiencing that world as much as possible in the run up to going to university, because I knew that it wasn't a long-term solution. You know, you can only escape into a video game for so long. Eventually you've got to go out there and be brave and try and make some friends. So when I arrived at university, I think my relationship with the game changed. I mean, up to that point, obviously I'd been playing the game a lot, and I hadn't really achieved what I'd wanted to socially, nor really academically. So my relationship with the game became much more focused on the music of the game. I'd be, you know, sat in my first year of uni reading contract law textbooks or whatever textbooks it might have been, listening to speaker og or the musty scent of fresh pate, and various other ambient in-game music. And that was primarily how I engaged with the game. If I did play it, it would be, I'd go to Toussaint, which is sort of my happy place in the game. It was, the best place. It's like the French Riviera, but in The Witcher. And then once I got into my second year of university, I continued to do the same thing, but then towards the end of my second year, I think it wasn't enough to just be listening to the music anymore. And maybe I was going through a little bit of a tough time. Maybe uni was a little bit more stressful, I'm not sure. But I did what must have been like my 7th playthrough of the game at that point, which is obviously kind of ridiculous. And I did an alchemy build, because I'd never done an alchemy build before. So I got the Archgriffin decoction, the Echidna decoction. You jump in the air and that makes your character heal. And then I'd go to the rune right and get the massive rend and just use all the stamina all in one go and then heal my character with a massive attack on the enemy. It was a really satisfying way to play the game. And that was essentially all I really did with the game until I finished uni. I never really engaged with it beyond that one playthrough and listening to the music. Now, that being said, I remember when starting that playthrough in the end of my second year, I've probably played the game for 800 hours, over the space of 3 years. An overgrown teenager, basically, sitting there playing this game for the 1000th time. And I was still finding new things to do. I remember this quest. It was sort of near Novigrad, out on the edge near Novigrad, out by the water. And there's this lady, she's a non-English speaker, and her son, they're from I think it's called from like a land far, far away or something like that. And Geralt has to help either her or this like bodyguard character. He has to pick a side between the two of them, and it's basically just essentially based on vibes. That's how he has to make the decision. And little stories like that still stick with me after all this time, And I remember then I got to Velen, and the pure slog that was Velen was just ridiculous. I don't know how, as a depressed teenager, this horrible place had made me happy. You've got corpses and drowners and witches and that guy with half of his ear chopped off when he gives his whole ear to the crones, and they're begging them to save them from some monster. I think it's a fiend or something. It's all so depressing, really, and horrible. But somehow for me, that was a place I really loved being when I was a teenager. It was something that somehow made me happy. I got through Velen largely through the quality of the stories there. I always think of the Bloody Baron quest line as a particularly amazing storyline. In my ending, he hung himself, which was really, really sad. But there was another quest line, or another side quest, I should say, that really stuck with me in Velen in that playthrough. It's one called Wild at Heart. Now, in that quest, you need to help a hunter called Neelan, who's looking to find his missing wife, Hannah. Geralt discovers that Neelan is a werewolf, and Hannah's jealous sister, Margaret, lured her into the woods at the full moon, hoping that she would leave him out of disgust. Instead, Neelan attacks Hannah, killing her, and Margaret escapes. The player is then presented with the choice of letting Neelan kill Margaret for her role in Hannah's death, or killing Neelan. The binary choice in this quest has no true good ending. There's only really one evil or another, where even a failure to act is an action in itself. Now, I'd say it's such a testament to the game that I remember that quest so well, and it's a really, really interesting plot line. Every time I tried to play the game after that, I really struggled to overcome what I would call the Velen hurdle, I guess. I bought the game on my Switch, I played it for like 5 hours, and I made a review, shameless plug, but it just looked a bit muddy, and I couldn't really get into it. And like I've said before, I knew the story so well, so there wasn't much left for me to achieve. I upgraded it on my PS5, and it looked great. It looked amazing. But again, all I'd really do was just walk around Toussaint and not really play that much of the game. I think probably towards the end of my time at university and just before I left uni, I was starting to think that probably my time with The Witcher had come to a close, that it had taught me everything it needed to, and I'd learnt everything that I was going to learn from it. Then in early 2021, it was just after the last lockdown, I moved to London. I thought it would be, a good idea. I had a job at the time, but I was working in debt management. It was a remote job, so I could sort of live wherever I wanted to, really. And it was a bit of a tough time for me, really. I had a girlfriend who was living down there, but I didn't know anybody in London. It was quite a scary place to move for a country bumpkin like me. And I found it quite intimidating. I was quite quite alone, really. And I wanted to push myself. You know, I wanted to get a new job in London, and you know, at the time I wanted to be a lawyer, and I applied for tons and tons of different jobs until eventually I got one toward the end of 2021. And just after I'd landed that job, things were going okay. You know, my relationship was pretty unhealthy at the time. And then just at the very beginning of 2022, my girlfriend at the time cheated on me. And I was crushed. You know, it was not an easy time for me. And it had already been difficult enough moving to London, being quite isolated, but to have that happen as well was kind of the nail in the coffin, I think, at that time. It was pretty rough. But I had an answer, the same answer I'd been using when I was at uni, the same answer I'd used when I was a teenager. You know, what was I going to do? What's this video about? I was going to play The Witcher 3 again. And I say this without irony, and I'm aware of the fact that this is a really cringy thing to say, but The Witcher 3 saved me again. You know, it was there for me in a really dark, difficult time. Geralt and his company of side characters, Yennefer, Triss, Ciri, they all existed in this bleak, low fantasy world, and they had, you know, essentially unbreakable spirits in the face of, you know, terrible odds, really, against the Wild Hunt. They were able to deal with this very, very difficult situation, and I could certainly deal with, you know, a rough patch in my early 20s if they could deal with that. And I appreciate their video game characters, but there's still you know, a bit of a metaphor there, I think. And I'm so grateful that they were there for me in that period of time. I'm grateful that was a story that I could experience. And strangely, I think as that playthrough got more positive, so did my life. You know, in January I kind of suffered through Velen. In February you got to Novigrad and things were maybe a little bit more positive. By March I was enjoying Skellige, and then I moved into a new house and I made some great new friends, lifelong friends I hope. And by that time, where was I but Toussaint, obviously, my happy place. It was kind of metaphorical, really. So I was lucky that the game was there for me, and I'm always grateful to the game for being there for me, because whenever things go to shit, it's you know, it's an ally, I guess. I don't know. Since then, playing the game has been a much more nostalgic thing for me, really. I don't use it in the same way that I used to. I think when I'm struggling, I tend to go out for a hike like I did today. But I do love the game's music, and I'll still listen to the ambient music and the story music. And recently, a friend of mine and I went to the concert, The Witcher in concert, to go and watch the live music in an orchestral performance. It was absolutely brilliant. It was really, really cool. I felt like such a massive nerd. I bought this t-shirt that I'm wearing, if you can see, I don't know. But yeah, we had a great time. It was really, really good. I've always loved the game, and giving it the credit that it deserves feels really important to me. You know, without it, I don't know that I would have developed in the same ways and into the same person that I am today. It's an incredible game with an incredible story. You know, and I think often when I think of the game's impact on me, I'm reminded of a scene at the very end of the game between Regis and Geralt, and they're sat together by the fireplace talking, and Regis asks Geralt, if you were to do it all over again, you had another shot at life, would you still choose to be a Witcher? And every time I finish the game, I always answer that question in the same way. Yes. I think it's a very affirming choice for me as the player and Geralt as the character. You know, it's a beautiful ending to a beautiful game. So yeah, thank you to the people at CD Projekt Red and Geralt as a character and The Witcher 3 in general, because yeah, it's a special game.